Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by UNA, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Ron Crabtree. Ron is the CEO of MetaOps and MetaExperts, organizations that are focused on business process improvement. He has over 30 years of experience implementing Lean, Six Sigma, and supply chain methodologies in industries from automotive and healthcare to government and financial services. So, hi, Ron. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks for inviting me, Kelly.
Sure. Now, I talked about the breadth of your experience very briefly in my intro, but what else do you think it's helpful for people to know about your professional journey?
Well, I did grow up in the automotive industry in materials management and operations. Actually got moved from the area I'm living in now to Metro Detroit back in '96. I worked in corporate purchasing for United Technologies Automotive. We had an ex-Toyota purchasing executive there and a gentleman that's now running a good chunk of Ford's purchasing group. And we were doing target and Kaizen costing back in 1996 for supplier rationalization projects. So I've always had this keen interest in what it takes to make big transformations things work in supply chain. And then we fast forward a little bit, I've been very involved with digital transformation awareness and how that impacts organizations. I'll mention that further, maybe a little later in the podcast. And more recently, I was honored to serve as an executive advisor for the Next Level Purchasing Association as they were developing their next generation of training and development for purchasing professionals. I'm actually a certified purchasing operations executive with NLPA, and I had the opportunity to work with them on integrating some best practices from a transformation management perspective. I'll call it lean practices into the knowledge base, which is unique with respect to what they offer. And they have a really cool little widget for assessing your procurement workforce skills, a cool little assessment tool. If you'd be interested in that, you can reach out to the Next Level Purchasing Association.
Excellent. Well, as you mentioned, transformation is certainly a big part of your professional focus. It's also huge within the broader world of procurement and supply chain. And so before we start talking about how to make transformation possible, even successful, I want to look for a minute at the difference between operational and digital transformation. So what makes those two things different? And to what extent does procurement need to coordinate them so that they both end up in the right place?
That's a great question. I see them as inexorably interfaced, right? Overlapping one another. It's very difficult to talk about operations and digitization, digital transformation as two different conversations. The nature of work, procurement is no exception to that. We were using computers 40 years ago to do procurement, and we're using them even more than we ever were before. And, even down to using AI to help us pull together information to work on a sourcing project, right? That's becoming very commonplace. So I see them as inexorably linked. And one of the things to think about as a purchasing professional is if you're not familiar with the term called business process management, or BPM, if you're not familiar with that, you might want to go to school on that a little bit and just kind of wrap your head around what that means. But it's really about people, process, and technology. And they're in that order for a reason. I've learned the hard way that most transformations fail because we forget to get the people connected properly before, during, and after we attempt to do things. And it's in that order, really understanding, the technology is crucial. And one of the big fallacies I see is, this big thing around AI being the big silver bullet cure. Well, AI is one of 30 different chunks of digital transformation technologies that any organization should be thinking about. I actually built out a whole program for that for one of our customers. And, the silver bullet cure thing just isn't going to happen. At the same time, I see it as a very process-driven thing. So from a purchasing perspective, procurement management perspective, we have processes, all kinds of them. We're going to talk more about that maybe in a little exercise later around sustainable change. But you really got to think about end-to-end process, and then where do people plug in? And then the technology is really the last part, not the leading part.
Now, it's interesting that you talked about people maybe wanting to go read up a little bit on business process management or learn more about it. And I do think one of the things that makes transformation such a challenge is that if you have someone who's been in procurement even for a long time, they might have category expertise. They might be effective negotiators. They might really know how to get into a conversation and draft the right contract or create the best value for the organization. But all of those things are different than leading transformation itself. In your experience, does the educational and professional background of most procurement professionals actually set them up for success if they're tasked with leading a transformation effort?
Unfortunately, no. And I've been a classical student of all of this. I started attending purchasing training back in 1979 when I was living in Southern California, working for Disney, and they had this very generous program paying for training. So I was going to Cal State Northridge, and they had pre-runner training to what today would be the APICS ASCM certification series. Okay. Some of the precursors to what now is rolled up over ISM and NAPM and some of those curriculums. So I'm very conversant with what's in that body of knowledge out there. And traditionally, the academics, God bless them, are really focused in on the nuts and bolts and, understanding what's possible, economics, the art of negotiations and all these other things. But when it comes to transformation, there's definitely been a blind spot. So, I mentioned I have a podcast of my own I run called MetaPod. And some of my guests I invite are really talking about how do you lead transformation. For example, we had Edmund Zark, I got to pronounce his name correctly, Zagarin. He's the CEO of Orchestral Software, and they're one of our partners. So they brought to market AI and artificial and gaming theory-based software to automate sourcing and procurement. And one of the things they're running into, which is just an indicator of this big gap in leading transformation, is they're working with very, very senior purchasing folks working in very large organizations, and they're struggling because they don't know, how do I put together a good business case? How do I engage, cross-functionally in the organization? How do I create a burning platform to break through the barriers with the IT shop, the CFO, the operations folks that I serve? They're really not taught how to leverage, their political capital and to be able to manage enterprise types of projects. It's just not been something we've been taught, unfortunately.
Well, and it's interesting too, you mentioned having your own podcast, and we've had a number of conversations here on the Sourcing Hero, either with other podcast hosts or about the podcasting format. And one of the things that I think has made it so successful and so popular is that people find information easier to consume when it's delivered to them in a digestible format. And part of that is the art of storytelling. So yes, in some cases, transformation is about very specific skills or understanding a process or figuring out ways to change it. But there's also that human to human connection and communication. Can we use storytelling in our efforts to, whether you want to talk about transformation or whether you want to start to talk about this idea of sustainable change? What role does communications play in all that?
Well, it's crucial. The big boys, the big consultants and researchers are saying, 70 to 80, 90% of transformation initiatives fail, right? They don't get the results they really should. And that's a scary number. And it really comes down to, I think storytelling is a crucial underlying skill set. I mentioned business process management earlier. Yeah. So the process part of that is, understand the end-to-end value stream. Who are all the players? What are all the functions? What are the agendas to work across, right, with this change we want to make? But then storytelling has to be done based on the audience for the storytelling. This is where we can get in a lot of trouble. For example, if our storytelling is upward to our bosses, well, first of all, as a practical matter, they have a very short attention span.
Very much so.
Right? So it's got to be very concise and get to the point. And it's got to connect to the enterprise initiatives they're personally accountable to. So if our storytelling doesn't take those two things into account, it's going to go flat. Then we take a look at, okay, now we need to do cross-functional storytelling. We need to be storytelling out to finance, operations, right? Maybe supply chain is actually a different function outside of purchasing. That's very common in the auto industry, by the way. They actually separate supply management, the whole planning, scheduling, and supply chain management from procurement. A very thick wall between them.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing lots of issues of purchasing folks struggling to get things done with their own supply chain team because we're not telling the stories and the context that they care about. A couple of problems. One is, unfortunately, you'll have competing priorities with these other functions, right? They have other objectives, things they need to accomplish. And if what we're trying to sell or tell the story about doesn't address what their reality is, it's going to go flat. Then we've got our procurement team, our storytelling to our team. Are we really conscious about generational differences? The boomers, Gen X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
I just talked about that yesterday on a different podcast around how do you become an employer of choice and how do you really become, a leader or an organization that people really want to work for? Well, a piece of that is generational awareness and storytelling done in a fashion that each of those can consume. So the danger here we get caught up in is we're telling our story, but we think one story serves all of our team members well. And that may be false, particularly if we've got a multi-generational workforce. Then if we start doing storytelling outside our four walls, upstream to our suppliers, maybe even downstream to our customers, because remember, customers are often also a supplier. In fact, they're always going to be a supplier of something, even if it's just information about demand, right? But in many cases, they're supplying a lot of other things, even raw materials we have to consume in what we do for our product or service. The storytelling's got to be tuned to what they need to hear. So my advice, get really clear about who's going to hear the story, and then make sure you get help to dial that in for that audience.
And I would think in order to be successful, thinking about all of those different audiences, if we can use that term, given that we're talking about storytelling, you have to both be aware of the message you're trying to deliver, the outcome you're trying to drive, but also the exact interests of the group that you're talking to. So it requires a great deal of perception and awareness. When you think of some of the most successful procurement executives and leaders that you've worked with, what are some of the things that set them apart? What are some of the things they do best?
I think there's three basic things. One is, embracing this notion that the thinking that got us here won't get us to where we need to go, right? So they're very open to the fact that we're going to have to question what we're doing. What was successful yesterday doesn't mean it's going to be successful tomorrow. So they're open-minded about that. And then the second thing is, they're basically questioning the status quo at all times. So it's real easy to slip into, we met our objectives. We're good for this year. We don't need to work any harder. Well, it doesn't work that way. The pressure never ends. So just being happy with as things are is super dangerous. And then the third one that I think about is, you got to be a great leader. And, there's this thing called employer of choice, right? There's 30 different things organizations should think about if they want to be able to have a good workforce for the future. Well, as a procurement leader, and if you have a team, it's on you to be a great leader people want to work for, and it's on you as a contributor to your company's strategy. How do we position ourselves as a true employer of choice that people want to work for? Do we have a great brand? Are we interviewing our people and finding out what they even say about us? Do we understand what they think about us? Have we listened to them, and do we understand those generational issues we need to address with the workforce? Right? Are we able to even address those? And if we're not, we have to acknowledge that. So I think those three things together are really the things that, like Alan Shevela, I consider him one of those great leaders. He runs supply chain procurement for Aludyne in the automotive industry. And you talk about a critical, tough organization and a tough business sector. Actually, he was actually one of my podcast guests, and he talked a lot about his vision of how he really, in a difficult industry where it's hard to attract good people, and how is he doing that? And Alan had some great ideas for that.
And I do think procurement has come a long way. I mean, when I joined 20 years ago, I remember somebody writing, procurement is like the island of misfit toys. It's where you send people and you never want to see them again, right? And so we try to not take that personally, right? Any of us that got put into procurement. But I think even procurement's brand has been improved, the opportunity to impact the organization, the power of being that interface with the supply chain. And yet it's a place where there's always change. So I think that brings us back around to some of what we had started to discuss around transformation. And a lot of times we hear about transformation, and maybe this is me being negative, but you instantly think, okay, well, that's going to be difficult. Change is always difficult. If we're trying to plan for or lead a transformational effort, we need to be on the lookout for signs that things are going off track so that we can correct as soon as possible. Given your experience with transformation, how can we go about trying to safeguard our transformation effort to the best of our ability?
Yeah, that's a really good one. First of all, we got to remember we're set up for failure right from the get-go, right? The cards are stacked against us. You said that really well. And resistance to change is natural, right? And, there's lots of consequences for failure. There's lost opportunities every day that we don't, get those cost reductions, just money out the window. We're never going to get it back. Every day we're not getting deliveries into our manufacturing on time. It's lost sales. We can never recoup. Low ownership at the point of attack by our team. It means we get to do all the work, and then if it's bad, it's enterprise risk. I mean, we can literally go out of business, and not be successful. So I think one of the things that I'd like to share, we're going to have a little fun here with a quick exercise, is stop and think about, with respect to this transformation, how are we doing with respect to the three key components to driving sustainable change? The first is the level of discomfort there is, but on the part of the people that are impacted by this. The second is the quality of the vision we have and how well articulated that is. And then thirdly, do we have the skills to actually execute on that? Give me an example. Let's just walk that out. What would be an example of a transformation that we could examine?
So I'm going to go way out on a limb here and pretend, because I'm always in for a good game. I work for an organization, and all of our contracts are currently stored in some sort of shared drive. Now, I've heard lots of talk about all these contract management platforms. There's all kinds of metadata and alerts I can set up, but we just haven't invested in that up to this point. And given the current risk landscape, my company thinks maybe this is the time to finally ditch the drive and move to something a little bit more modern and comprehensive. So if I want to digitize my contract management process, how would you go through with me of sort of walking through those three things to make sure I'm set up for success with that transformation?
Well, the first step is, make a RACI chart. That's responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. Make a RACI chart of everybody that's going to be playing part of this, right? They're either going to be responsible for doing it, they're directly involved with doing it, they need to be consulted, or they have to approve it, be involved. Think about, your storytelling with that. But then behind that, you say, so what's their level of discomfort with the way we do business today?
Yeah.
So they think, oh, I like doing this work. I don't see any advantage whatsoever to digitizing. Well, their level of discomfort associated with this change is very low. So you actually give that a percentage, right?
Okay.
Between 100% is they're like beating your door down, screaming at you every day. We have to fix this. It's making us crazy. Then you would say you have a high level of discomfort. But you have to think about that RACI chart, right? Because everybody's got to buy into this. This is an enterprise impact. It is. It's going to make a difference to how you operate. So you got to give that a percentage, right? And you need to do it across, particularly the people that have to do something differently. And if they don't have a burning platform, you've got a problem. So let's just say you're 50% of the way there. Half of your audience is pretty good with this. The other half's like, why are we doing this, right? Let's just give that 50%. Then you say, great, let's talk about the vision. Well, in this case, we need to articulate exactly what does future look like, right? We know how we do things today, and our vision for when we're done looks like this, and this, okay? And we've got that very clearly articulated, but we keep drilling. We say, okay, and what's going to be different for each person? Instead of doing this, you're now going to be doing that, right? So we're really clear about what's different at the end of this, all the way down almost to the task level. How well have we articulated that? Do people actually understand where we're going and why we're going there and how we're going to actually do it? So we get it, how are we going to do it? And the old axiom is people would rather fight than switch, right? People would rather fight your change then accept something they don't understand. So you give that a number. Let's say you're 50%. And then finally, do we have the skills to execute? Now, to be successful in our implementation, if we need 30% of our workforce to be doing something they've never touched or know about, we're not ready.
Yeah.
We're going to have a gap in the skills to actually execute, which assumes we want to do it, assumes we're actually clear about what we're doing and how, and do we have the skills? So let's pretend we're 50% of the way there. Well, multiply those three percentages. You get 50 times 50 is 25. 25 times 50 is 12.5%. So we go, uh-oh. So our likelihood of success is really bad.
Yeah.
So now we got to back up. So wait a minute. Okay. As leaders, if you have to, as is the situation, and say, okay, great. How can we address where we're low on those numbers? Maybe we have to take another step back and say, you know what? Instead of fixing everything for the target project, like the automation you described, we're going to pick one commodity and 100 SKUs, and we're going to do a rapid 90-day cycle to learn and get through that learning curve, demonstrate success, and then come back and do a bigger rollout so that we can mitigate the skill and the burning platform problem, right?
Yeah.
So that's a kind of skill that's just not intuitive. By the way, I've got a little one-page cheat sheet of how that exercise runs. You can actually do it with any process, any transformation at any level, from enterprise, changing the world, to down to a tactical project at the department level. This technique works really well, and I'm happy to share that.
And I would definitely encourage people to reach out to you depending on where they have found this. Your LinkedIn profile will be linked down below. That's a great way to reach out and ask. Ron, before I let you go, I want to bring you into a tradition we have here at the Sourcing Hero podcast. So I'm going to give you two questions. You can pick either one. And to date, I have not heard a wrong answer yet. So I'm convinced it doesn't exist. But your options are, what does the idea of a sourcing hero mean to you? Or what do you think heroism looks like in a business context?
You know, I think there's a combined answer to that. And, most of us are familiar with this notion that, everything's going to change, right? And we're going to have to be good at it. But when it comes down to change, I really like to go back to the serenity prayer. And I think all of us have heard it at one time or another. And it goes something like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
That's actually giving me chills, Ron. It's making me think that this challenge with transformation is timeless, and it's just a key part of who we are as human beings, that there's always this desire to achieve something better, but then there's something core and human about us that sees the risk in changing where we are or how we currently are doing things. I actually think that is an excellent application of the Serenity Prayer.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Ron, this has been a really interesting conversation. I think a ton of practical advice. I certainly do, as we said, encourage people to reach out to you and get the cheat sheet. If people are listening in, is LinkedIn the best way to connect with you? Is there another way you would like for them to reach out?
I have something even better. Go out to my company website, metaops.com, META, and we are the original Meta. We have a trademark coming through on it. But that's MetaOps, OPS, META-OPS, metaops.com. And then on the top page, you'll see Talk to Ron, right? So actually it says book Ron to speak. There's a link to book Ron to speak. That jumps you to another page. You scroll down a little bit, and there's a button to get on my calendar.
Perfect. Well, it's a direct line. Everybody now has the inside connection to get on your calendar. Ron, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise and for spending some time with us today.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well, and always remember that you can be a hero too.